Food is far more than what ends up on our plates. It is about public health, economic development, climate resilience, indigenous knowledge, and national security. This week on Sources, we explore why the future of food matters, not only for Guyana, but for the Caribbean and the wider world. As countries grapple with rising food costs, climate change, and increasingly fragile supply chains, the focus has shifted beyond producing enough food to building food systems that are equitable, sustainable, and resilient. Here in Guyana, these issues are becoming increasingly significant as the country works to strengthen agriculture, advance food security, and ensure indigenous knowledge and leadership help to shape the future. This week on Sources, Executive Director of the New York City Food Policy Center at Hunter College, Dr. Mark Chatarpal, discusses the future of food policy, public health, and sustainable food systems. While in Guyana, he has been engaging with local stakeholders and indigenous communities on building more resilient food systems. I'm Svetlana Marshall, and this is Sources. Good evening and welcome to Sources. I'm your host, Svetlana Marshall. Tonight we'll be talking about food policy, and to do so with me, I have Dr. Mark Chatarpal. He's the Executive Director of the NYC Food Policy Center, a food anthropologist and a doctoral lecturer at the Department of Nutrition and Public Health at Hunter College. Dr. Chatarpal, welcome to Sources.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And welcome back to Guyana.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's always good to be home.
I know you frequent Guyana quite a lot,
Yes.
and you left at an early age.
I did.
But, persons looking, they may be seeing you for the first time. Let us
Yes.
know a little about yourself.
Well, that's a great question. I grew up in Guyana. I attended St. Ignatius Secondary High School in the Rupununi, and I also attended Central High School right here in Georgetown. And from there, I decided to pursue my degrees at the University of Toronto. And then after finishing my bachelor's degree, I got a direct entry into a PhD program at Indiana University, where I completed my PhD in cultural anthropology, specializing in food anthropology.
Did I hear you correctly? You said you got a direct
Yes,
entry?
yes.
Wow.
I was extremely fortunate to work with very passionate scholars, many from the Caribbean, one from Guyana in particular, who saw my potential and encouraged me to start studying food, not through the lens of nutrition at first, but through the lens of culture. And I think I really resonated with some of the topics that were happening at the time, specifically when it came to food insecurity and indigenous land rights. And after doing some work with the Maya peoples in Belize, and this was just after the ruling by the Caribbean Court of Justice, that research took a lot of traction and it got a lot of attention. And I would like to say that thanks to their support and to my research interests, gaining direct entry into a PhD program was much easier than most.
Good to hear. Now, why food policy? You could, like you said, you were
Yes.
encouraged, but you took a decision.
Yes.
Why food policy?
Great question. Food policy is really about guidelines, regulations, rules that governments, organizations put in place to make sure that everyday people are able to access, everyday people are able to purchase at equitable prices. And I'm sure you've seen in fairly recent times that food has been on everyone's minds.
Yeah.
And
Prices are going up?
the prices are going up. Food inflation in Guyana, well, in Georgetown specifically, is well over 75%. The question I like to ask is, okay, so what are you going to do about it? What regulations are you going to put in place? It's very nice to say a very well-curated line in a public speech, but then who is doing the work and how does that get enforced? How does that get regulated? And that's where someone like myself and my team, my amazing team, comes into play. So at the Hunter College NYC Food Policy Center, that's where our specialization focuses on. And even within recent times, I'm sure many of your Guyanese viewers from the Guyanese diaspora, specifically in New York, are aware of the new mayor's initiative where he is putting in a series of grocery stores throughout all of the boroughs that sell food at discounted prices. Same food, but at affordable prices for people who are dealing with extreme food costs. And we were asked, and my team and I were asked to participate in closed door discussions to provide insights and areas for them to actually utilize in their plans going forward. So the work of food policy and food policy centers like my own play a pivotal role in how not only major cities like New York City, whose food procurement budget is well over $500 million a year, but also I am expanding the New York City Food Policy Center's role to also take on a global mandate.
Okay.
And that is something I'm sure we're going to be talking about today
Yes,
as well.
because you've not only visited Guyana, you went to Belize, you went to Ghana, and of course you're based in New York.
Yes.
What have these experiences taught you about food, culture, public policy, and social justice?
It's a really good question. I will say that if you think about culture, and I were to visit you in your personal capacity, especially within Guyana, the first thing people tend to offer is some food.
Yeah.
They tend to want to express who they are, their cultural identity, through the lens of food, whether it's through the culinary lens, which is the way how food is prepared, or through the lens of, let's say, food and expression. Food is used in art. Food is an integral part of our own cultural expressionism. And I think that for us, especially when we start talking about food policy, this plays a really important role in general, just how we view ourselves and how we define our own cultural identity. Also, when it comes to food policy, our work really has a niche. We are not agriculturalists. We're not focusing on increasing crop production. We are asking the questions in terms of the impact of those different forms of food production. So when it comes to food and its connection to culture, that's a major intersection that happens not only in Guyana, but every other part of the world. It's an integral part of how we express ourselves.
And I'm happy that you mentioned that, because oftentimes when people reference to food policy, they go directly to agriculture,
Yes.
or they speak about nutrition alone. So it's tend to be isolated. How would you define food policy, and what should a modern food policy look like for a country like Guyana?
Great question. First of all, I do believe it's important that we broaden the conversation when it comes to food. If you've noticed, I've been very careful not to overuse the term agriculture. Because of Guyana's colonial history, it is very easy for us to assume that agriculture is just the only way our food is actually expressed, especially through policy. However, because of how monolithic that term is, it is very easy for people not to understand that food has multiple dimensions: food policy, food and culture, gastronomy, culinary expression, and the list goes on as well. You can look at food through the lens of gender. You can look at food through the lens of food justice, food sovereignty, food security, the right to food, which is something we're going to touch on as well. So my job, and one thing that I really enjoy, is to express and to expand our conversations about food so that your viewers and people who are interested in the topic understand that it is not only about rice, sugar, and any other major commodity that is obviously advertised within Guyana. To your second point about food policy in relation to Guyana, that is a conversation that we can have and talk about for a very long time. I think it's important that we clearly define and introduce new terminology into the Guyanese lexicon. Why don't we just call food for what it is? Food. Why do we still use the term agriculture? I think that a good first step is to also change names and change the way the public perceives the topic. Maybe as grandiose as this may be, but instead of the Ministry of Agriculture, perhaps maybe the Ministry of Food Sovereignty or the Ministry of Food Security, so that new viewers and people who are interested in the topic can start to view the issue with more nuanced lenses. And I think that's a good first start. People will obviously say then, okay, so you're changing the name, but what else needs to be changed?
Exactly.
And I think that, quite frankly, in my role as ED of the Food Policy Center, I'm only here in my capacity to showcase the work we're currently doing. So I can't go into extensive explanations of what should be done by the existing administration.
All right. Well, but I'll definitely try to get some more
No
out of
problem.
you on that. But explain food sovereignty to me.
So food sovereignty, if I were to use layman terms, is the ability for people to eat food and to access food with dignity and food that is culturally appropriate to them. And that is substantially different from the UN's definition of food security, which only looks at food through the lens of access, accessibility, availability, and pretty much it's quite mundane in terms of that description. Because let's say, for example, an Indigenous school in Region 9. It's very easy to say, let's talk about the hot meals program, for example, that the children are entitled to have a meal. If you look at that issue through the lens of food security, yes,
So, well, yes, they're having
they're
access.
having access to a meal, they're having availability to a meal, and quite frankly, it might look like the problem is being solved. Through the lens or through the viewpoints of food sovereignty, you can start asking questions like, where is this food being sourced from? Is this food being served with dignity? And not served, but people have access to it through the lens of dignity. Is the food culturally appropriate to the space? I think we've both collectively seen in recent renditions through the media of meals that are being served to Indigenous children in particular that are substantially different from what they're eating. And what they're eating is extremely nutritionally dense, meaning it's really good. So what are you introducing to these children in through the school program? So through the lens of food sovereignty, you're able, not only like myself as someone that's external a little bit to the issue, but from the position of, let's say, a village council or from an executive council, to ask the questions of, is this food pertinent to the cultural identity of the space? And if it's not, what rules and regulations, i.e. food policy, can we put in place to actually reflect those realities? Because if there is one thing that I've seen in my own research, personally and in my capacity as executive director, is that the idea of stigma when it comes to children eating food in schools, especially Indigenous children, is extremely pertinent, not only in Guyana alone, but in many other places. So even, for example, in some of the work that I did in Belize with the Maya, we found responses where the children were telling their parents, who told us that they were throwing their food away before they got to school because they did not want the teachers to see them bringing food wrapped in banana leaves. And even in some of the work that we did recently, that stigma of what is being perceived as good food versus what is actually culturally appropriate food, those dimensions are still being enforced within the schooling system. So food sovereignty is a much more important, I would like to say, lens to view this issue.
And how do we address issues like food insecurity? We talk about inflation. we talk about some of the other challenges affecting how we source food. For example, the food chain, and we've had recent issues with that, and the
Yes.
prices went up,
Mm-hmm.
and everything else. And with regards to diet-related diseases, because based on what we're accessing on our markets, how do we confront the challenges, or how do we address food sovereignty and food insecurity while combating these specific challenges?
Well, that is a good question that's going to take me some time to unravel, but I'll do my best. First of all, let's talk about the terminologies being used. So you're talking about food inflation,
Yeah.
which is a dimension that we don't talk about in Guyana. Quite frankly, Guyana does not have a problem with food production.
No.
We produce here a considerable amount of food. In fact, it has been used within the political strata as a way to advertise Guyana as a food secure space. The question, I believe, is about food access. How are people able to access fresh produce, fresh vegetables, and more importantly, at what price point? And that is where the real problem starts to lure its head, because food inflation is a substantial issue here in the city. What measures are being put in place is where the question is something that we need to talk about some more. So, I would like to say that there needs to be some more work done in looking at food subsidies. And it's not something that is not tried and tested in many other countries in the world. For example, even in New York, the most developed metropolitan in the world, and arguably the most diverse foodscape on the planet, in terms of you can hop on a train and get some doubles in Queens, and then, hop on a train and go to Brooklyn and you get something else. The question is really about what is the state and what are other organizations willing to do to subsidize the cost of food or the mechanisms to getting food into the city. And I'm curious to know what those mechanisms will be. Yes, better roads from farms to markets are always good, but there has been a tendency to overindulge on road development in recent times. My question is, what about cold storage? Also, what about data collection?
Well, we're not big on that. So we definitely have to work on it.
Do we know what is the fresh tonnage weight of fruits and vegetables that are tossed in Border Market or
Nope.
tossed in Starbrook Market or tossed in Parika Market? Why is it that we don't have state-sponsored cold storage facilities that can extend the shelf life of this produce? No farmer, and I repeat this, no farmer wants to see their produce waste, whether in the market or in their farms. We also don't have a running dashboard to look into the fresh weight tonnage of food that is wasted in the farms. So we're overproducing. We still struggle with accessing that overproduction, and we're still struggling collectively to figure out an approach to make sure that that food is actually being brought into the city and making sure that the price is properly controlled. Now, in the Minister of Agriculture's defense, there is a website, that's a page on their website that showcases the recommended cost for bora and pak choy and baigan and so on.
Is this the farmer's GUI? I think that's
Yes.
what you're referencing to.
However, what research is being done to clash that with the reality of what it is being sold in the real market space? So there is a considerable data gap. And I know when I start talking about data, people's eyes tend to glaze over. But this is great space for good research to be done, not only by external organizations outside of the country, but by students at the University of Guyana.
Yes.
Young people getting involved because this actively impacts them. The next thing also is, let's talk about food regulation for a moment and food procurement. Let's go back to the hot meals program. Can there not be explicit rules put into place where there is a sliding scale of a ratio of, let's say, if local farmers in the villages are unable to provide 40% for now of the produce being purchased through this program, the state will work to make sure that these farmers are able to get up to that level to maintain consistency, and then continue moving that scale upwards so that at one point, let's say the maximum threshold, that 75% of the fresh fruits and vegetables that are going into the school program is coming from immediate communities instead of major transport hubs. So, for example, our work with the South Rupununi District Council in South Rupununi, Region 9, much of the food is purchased through independent contractors who are coming from Lethem. And when we started following the food chain, as you're rightly pointing out, they are not sourcing from local farmers in Region 9. They're sourcing straight from Bonfim, from Bovista, and maybe even onwards to Manaus. So the state is also losing access to, or losing the opportunity to actually support local farmers because of poor regulation. How do they enforce regulation? That's not my business. But how can villages and small communities that have the right to put their regulations in place, especially Indigenous communities under the Amerindian Act, there is room there for them to design their own food policies.
And we'll definitely talk about that because
Yes.
I know you recently visited Rupununi and did some work co-designing food policy.
Yes.
But before we get to that, you spoke about, Guyana being viewed as food secure, and oftentimes we talk about this and reaching a specific target. But we also import, like the rest of the Caribbean,
Yes.
a lot of food,
There is a world-renowned anthropologist that recently passed away by the name of Sidney Mintz, who is known as one of the founding fathers of food anthropology, to put it nicely. And he argued in his work that the Caribbean has been arguably the most globalized space in the world, meaning even from the enslavement era to indentureship, the colonial process of bringing people from all over the world into this region, Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Jamaica, the Greater Antilles, the list goes on. You're bringing people from all over the world, and you're also bringing their food preferences with them. And the British made tremendous amounts of money. I'm using the British, but I can switch these out as you see fit. But they made a tremendous amount of money selling food to indentured workers who were working on the plantations, for newly freed and newly liberated enslaved African Guyanese. The foods that many of them were able to access were now being available for purchase. So we have developed collectively a global palate. So the idea of eating local is very, very appealing stylistically. But we haven't spent enough time doing 24-hour dietary recalls, which is like, tell me what you've eaten, Svetlana, for the last 24 hours, and then let's trace where all these things are coming from, and then connect that directly to what our import bill looks like. And you would notice very, very quickly that much of our daily consumption pattern is a reflection of our global preference. So, my question, I would like to throw the question back to you. What did you have for dinner last night? And as you're starting to think through this question, you start seeing a larger issue at play. Now, do I believe that the 2030 goal that that CARICOM is putting forward is attainable? With strong will and determination, I think so. But what efforts are being put in place to at least recognize that the Caribbean has a global palate? And I agree also, because I know there's going to be agricultural economists who are listening to this and saying import substitution is very important as well. And I agree. There is room for import substitution, meaning that things that we can grow within the region we should focus on. But at what environmental cost? Is it important for us to actually grow our own soy when many other parts of the world, there's been so much thorough documentation on the environmental degradation that is happening? In recent times, there have been some recent national headlines about farms being, for a lack of a better term, brought to the public view in nearby spaces. My question to the general audience is, what about the farms like Duble Ranch or the Santa Fe farm in the Rupnui that has thousands upon thousands of acres? And the intentionality there is to grow soy, to grow GM corn, and to spray tonnages of pesticides and fertilizers. What's the impact of that runoff on our waterways? And where are we gearing towards? Making our animal feed cheaper, but at what trade off when it comes to the environment? So it needs to be approached very delicately. I think, quite frankly, there's a rush happening with very big questions that need to be asked about proper regulation. And also, more importantly, we need to recognize that the Guyanese palette is hinged on a global space. And in doing so, we'll be able to fine tune exactly what our position is when it comes to growing local versus buying global.
Now, you recently, well, recent is a relative word, but you did a paper, one of your latest papers. You focused on food policy on Guyana, on CARICOM. And one of the things you pointed out and you argue is that Guyana already has an explicit constitutional right to food. And this is on the Article 40 of the Constitution. Tell me more about this, the constitutional, you're arguing that, hey, we have this already, we just need to implement.
Thank you. So, in my own research, Guyana is one of a few countries that has an explicit constitutional right to food. Now, the term the right to food is coined by the United Nations, where people have the right, the legal right, to consume food with dignity. The drafters of Guyana's constitution, in Article 40-1, I believe, in there it explicitly says that every Guyanese citizen, I'm paraphrasing, has the right to be free of hunger, which is inherently connected to the right to food. Wouldn't it be interesting if a collective of sharp-thinking individuals here who are seeing the inflated cost of foods and the concerns for the environment and what is happening within our foodscape, another term, use the legal mechanisms to start thinking about what the state is obligated to do? And so in that article, I am articulating Guyana's constitutional right to food, but the constitutional right to food to be interpreted by the Guyanese citizenry and not by the state. Because the state will, needless to say, regardless of who's in power, would want to interpret the right to food through their lens, which, because of Guyana's colonial history, will lean towards saying we need to do more large-scale agriculture, mega farming, because that is their viewpoint of what food sovereignty or food security, whichever term your viewership would prefer, should look like. My point is that every citizen has a right to make that determination for themselves, and there is a legal mechanism embedded in Guyana's constitution that we need to spend some more time exploring. In fact, in my own interviews during my PhD work, I did 16 months of research here and also spent a lot of time embedded in 2 government ministries from my respondents, in addition to other Indigenous organizations and groups. So I'm very comfortable to say what I'm about to say, which is my respondents clearly pointed out that even though Chetty Jagan and Forbes Burnham were at odds in the public viewpoints, one of the very few things they actually agreed on was the importance of Guyana's food sovereignty. They never used that term, but it was important that Guyana was able to produce food at a rate where the cost of food was substantively lower than what was being sold elsewhere.
And so do you think, you referenced this earlier and you spoke about the difference between food security and food sovereignty. Is that the direction you're saying? Yes, we spoke about food security, but it's more, we should definitely move in the direction of food sovereignty.
I think that for any Guyanese who wants to read the Constitution of Guyana, in fact, let me rephrase that. I think every Guyanese should read the Constitution of Guyana. It is part and parcel of their own rights to know what is in there. and not wait to be told what it is. If you look at Article 40 very carefully, it really echoes food sovereignty as a platform for Guyana's future. And even in my discussions with people who are legal experts, this clause in Guyana's constitution, it was considered aspirational at one point, meaning that this is something that they wrote into the constitution that we can kind of work towards. But even in those discussions I've had with legal experts, many of them are saying that the idea of it being aspirational is a thing of the past. It actually can be enforceable. And that, according to one of my respondents, a very important person within the legal world here in Guyana, said that it is not without teeth, and that it is, and that's a direct quote, that it actually has pertinence. And I really believe that if it's one thing Guyanese people, or if it's three things Guyanese people love to rally around, is food, I would like to say sports, and spirituality. And I think the draft of the Constitution had a sense that food was one of those few elements that really push past the cultural and ethnic differences that tend to surface from time to time in this country. And so the right to food, the constitutional right to food in Guyana, is something that we really need to spend some more time fleshing out. And I would love to have further discussions with people who are willing to have hard discussions about that and to work towards something that we can actually work as a collective on. And with the influx of revenue coming from oil exploration, I think Guyana is pivoted at the right time now to make those substantial changes to help adjust our future, or would like to say our food future.
Now, your work focuses largely on indigenous food systems. Why
Yes.
that in particular?
I think we all have that thing or that area that we love to focus on, whether as a researcher or as just an everyday human being. For me, indigenous food systems is something that is very keen and dear to my own research interests. And Svetlana, regardless of what is happening here in the city, it goes without saying that indigenous groups are still the most marginalized people in this country, not only historically, but even in current times. And my own passion for that topic is something that has fueled my own research on my research interests and my own energy and motivation. But also, even as executive director of the Food Policy Center, I've made it clear to the general audience in the United States, and I'm saying it here as well, that it's important that we feature food policy and the voices of the most marginalized within the field of food policy. So to address that, I believe the voices of indigenous peoples, not only here in Guyana, but other parts of the world, need to be brought front and center. Because food policy tends to be designed by people who are in extreme positions of power in well air-conditioned rooms, and there tends not to be a lot of interaction. So, for example, at the FPC, as we like to call it, we organized one of the cities, New York City's first Indigenous Food Policy Summit. And we brought indigenous scholars from all over the country, and even some from Guyana that came up, to talk about food policy through the lens of indigeneity. In December, we are going to be having one of the things that I'm planning is the city's. I would like to say the city's first, but I have to double check that. But a Black Food Policy Summit, looking at food policy through the lens of Blackness, and what does that mean for food policy design within New York City? Wouldn't it be amazing to have those kind of conversations within Guyana when it comes to food policy design, where indigenous peoples can say something and it's actually being utilized properly? Afro-Guyanese peoples are able to have conversations about food and what is culturally appropriate to them in their respective communities. And that the state, regardless of who's in power, is agile enough and technically sound to be able to create policies that are reflective of both spaces so that it's not monolithic, which is something that tends to happen from time to time. So going back to your original question, Yes, I'm fascinated about doing work with Indigenous groups because they need as much support as possible. But we are a technical partner with the South Rupununi District Council, and I would love to say that they are designing these policies by themselves. We are just giving some tools and things, but they're research tools, but they're designing this for themselves, by themselves, for themselves.
Tell me more about that because I know you recently visited Rupununi and you did some work helping them to, like you said, to craft food policy. So tell me more about the initiative. Who are part of your teams? Where exactly you visited? What exactly was done?
Okay. So I don't use the word helping because it also carries a little bit of stigma when it comes to it. We look into collaborating, and
Yeah.
that's our platform. So our work with the South Rupununi District Council, for your viewership and people who are unaware, is a collection of 21 Indigenous communities in South Rupununi. 20 of them are Wapishana, and one of those communities, Makushi. And because of their legal footing within their territorial rights, they, and under the auspices of the Amerindian Act, they have the legal right to create policies for themselves. It doesn't have to be food policies, but policies. But in the Amerindian Act, it also talks about the villages having the right to also make recommendations for agriculture. They're using that mechanism for themselves now to say it's important that, one, we recognize that the influx of non-communicable diseases, diabetes, hypertension, etc., is happening in our communities. And instead of waiting for the state to do something about it, or maybe the rate of what the state is doing is not fast enough, they're taking it upon themselves to create a series of guidelines and measures to curtail what is happening there. But that is only one factor. So our meetings, our initial round of meetings, occurred in SRDC territory. And we will be continuing to do this work with them in the immediate future. Our partnership with them is for a few years because I don't like entering into short-term partnerships. And the goal is for them to, one, identify the nutrition transition that has occurred in their communities. Nutrition transition is a term that recognizes that because of the influx of the Western diet and the consumption of highly processed foods, there is a direct connection to that and the spike in non-communicable diseases. So these communities are recognizing that, and I have a wonderful tool that I encourage people to do, and I've had them do, which was I had all of our participants come together as a group, and they were all women, which is fantastic because, quite frankly, women get the work done. And I asked them, here are three categories: the farm, the forest, or the savanna, and the shop. List for me everything that you're consuming from them. And they listed it in extreme detail. And just from that exercise alone, they started seeing something at play. And then in the second round of our discussions, I said, list for me everything that you've eaten in the past, as far back as you can remember, what you eat now, and what you would like to eat in the future. And in the past, there are varieties of foods that were phenomenal. And now it's bacon tea and chow mein, right? And a lot of rice instead of cassava. And what would you like to eat in the future? And you see a lot of connections back to what they were eating in the past, but with tweaks here and there to make it more appealing for young people. That exercise, and there were some others, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into it. But that exercise alone is a powerful tool for them to sit back and collectively recognize that our consumption patterns have changed considerably from what we were eating from the farm, the forest, and the savanna to what we're depending on the shop for now. And what is being sold at the shops collectively is a series of convenient foods, which is very important as well because people are busy, but highly refined carbohydrates, oily foods, cheap foods that are being produced with very weird labeling that we haven't even talked about labeling laws as well. And so this is just an initial first pass to start that conversation, but it was a powerful one to have nonetheless. And I think that something has started in the South European District Council that other Indigenous councils should pay attention to, because they are exercising their legal rights to design food policy and to handle and to tackle a major issue that is happening within their territories.
Earlier, you spoke about us having like a global palette, and when I asked the question about reducing the importation bill that CARICOM and Guyana and all the countries within CARICOM would have spoken about extensively, right? And you spoke about the environmental impact, but don't you think that if we produce our own food and reduce that bill, then we'll be able to address things like the quality? Because oftentimes, yeah, you may get the food, but the quality of what you're seeing on the market, some of the things like you rightfully said, you don't even know. You don't even know what you're eating because the label is in a completely different language.
Yes.
And so that's an important issue. So
I agree. It's a good point that you're bringing up. A couple of things to keep in mind. The major initiatives that are being done for large-scale agriculture right now is really looking at it through the lens of mega soy production for the sake of creating a cheaper basis for animal feed. And there are some merits to that argument. However, I still have to circle back to the environmental issues coming to play. And it's something that folks in Guyana don't like to talk about a lot because you can't see it happening in real time. But going back to your point about labeling, and let's talk about fresh produce. And I still would like to hold fast that fresh produce in Guyana, from a production standpoint, was never an issue. It's the food access and the moving of those foods and the mechanisms that are lacking to make the movement of those foods from, let's say, Hububak Dam or somewhere in Charity, bringing it into the coast. Those mechanisms are still lacking substantially, even though there is a lot of narratives being put out there about things being fixed. The real reflection, the litmus test of that being fixed is if the prices are coming down, and they're not. Now, is there space for young agriculturalists and young food producers to capitalize on the market space? Absolutely. And I do think that there should be some more initiatives to encourage young people to grow. But that brings up the cultural impact of that. We haven't spent enough time researching what are young people's perception of growing food and being farmers and the stigmas connected to that. And the assumption is we'll just introduce a lot of technology, and that is somehow going to convince them that they should adopt that. I am not easily sold on that premise. I want to see more information and more data being done, more research being done on that front, where young people are brought together in collectives and being asked hard questions, and then their responses actually being reflected back into the rooms where these policies are being drafted. And I would like to make a claim that that mechanism is not functioning properly.
Okay. Now I want to go back to the work.
And the labeling. Guyana still struggles with proper labeling laws to make sure that the consumers know what they're eating. Yeah. In many other countries, if the food is coming into the country, they are required to change the labels to reflect what is happening or what are the requirements are within that specific country. The United States is a great example of that.
I think the laws are there for that, but
the implementation
is always an issue here.
Hence food policy.
Yeah. Now, going back to the work you've done with the South Rupununi District Council, at what stage the policy is at? You said you have a multi-year partnership with that council. How does it work? Is it the policy completed? When does implementation take place, and how is implementation taking place?
That's a great question. Two parts to that question. One, I cannot speak for the SRDC. Yeah. I would encourage you to perhaps have a conversation with Tushel Nicholas Fredericks, who is the chairman of the SRDC. I also have noticed the immediate rush to try to implement policies, broadly defined. And not a lot of effort is made to carefully build and, as using a construction term, scaffolding what data we're using to build up towards specific recommendations. So for now, this is a first pass to have an initial conversation. Those leaders of the community then go back into their respective villages and have further conversations about their food. Then they come back and share. Then they go back one more time. And
So
then
it's
they
an
come back.
extensive.
It's extensive back and forth. Because even as an external organization like the Food Policy Center or any other organization, we must also adhere to free, prior, and informed consent, which is FPIC, that Indigenous peoples have the right to enforce. So the constant going back and forth and having these discussions with their village representatives is incredibly important. What is more so exciting for me personally is the amount of data that is generated from those discussions. So now imagine the listing I was telling you about, the farm and the forest and the savanna and the shop. Think about a collection of 21 villages providing a comprehensive listing of that so that you have a granular detail of this happening. And then you can easily, any nutritionist can start easily seeing the consumption of refined carbohydrates, or maybe these are traditional foods that were being consumed in the past that they're indicating they want to eat again. What can we put in our recommendations to make sure that those things are present for the new future? So the more information that can be generated by the people for themselves is incredible, and we have to give them the time to develop that. Hence the importance of long-term partnerships and the fighting the urge to rush towards a quick solution, because there is dispensation of funds coming in from oil sources and whatnot. We still need to be thoughtful, methodical in how we're rolling out food policies, because quite frankly, there are a lot of white elephants within the field of agriculture in Guyana that are still an eyesore. And the last thing that anyone wants to do is to roll out something that is very new in the country through the SRDC, and it doesn't withstand the test of time.
And that's an important issue, because
Yes.
we always come, like, I remember there was a period we were talking about 10-point plans, and now we're talking about a lot of policies and so forth.
Yes.
Not a lot of implementation, because
As the old Creole saying goes, guitar and motar is two different tar. So it's important that we have enough data to then make informed decisions. And that is something that any agency or any organization should embrace in terms of an operational context.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you're not only working with the Rupununi Council, but you're also
The South Rupununi
South
District
Rup-
Council.
Yes, but you're also doing some work with UG. Is that so?
So we are in the middle of having some initial conversations, because my goal, I actually teach a course on food policy, and I have made it free of charge for a few Indigenous peoples from Guyana to take the course at Hunter College.
Nice.
I teach the course asynchronously online. So they're able to access using the IT hubs that are available in their villages. But the goal is to open up the space to have conversations about food from multidimensional standpoints and viewpoints. So for me to make that a success, I've tried it with people within the South Rupununi District Council, and many of them were present for our discussions recently. The goal now is to have conversations with people at the University of Guyana to see who's interested in learning about food policy. What are ways that we can collaborate? What opportunities are there for students there to learn with my students and with other students overseas? And then more importantly, how do we bring them all together? Indigenous students from Guyana's in whatever regions they are, whether it's in the SRDC or the Upper Mazaruni District, it doesn't matter. How do we get them to interact with students from New York, maybe from other parts of the world, and all under the same roof? Because for me, I think to have a good conversation about food policy, it's important to have a wide
Yeah.
and diverse audience that's present. And I'm hoping that it inspires a next generation of thinkers and food scholars to take up my role and to do more than I'm trying to do.
Well said. Now, closing remarks as
Sure.
in, what recommendations, and along the way you've offered plenty, but to sum it up, what would
Yes.
be the key recommendations you would put forward to the policymakers of our country to address food sovereignty? You said, it's already embedded in our constitution,
Hmm.
stated there clearly. But what recommendations you put forward?
It's a great question. And I've been saying that all through this interview. I think, for one, it is absolutely important that there is transparency in how policies are being designed. We have to start from a position of building public trust in terms of policies within the field of food that is reflective of what the people are actually wanting and what they need. I think that is a great first step that oftentimes tends to go unnoticed, even in discussions in other forums. Number two, I really think it is time to radically think about how food administration is done in this country. We still follow a British system where there's specific ministries that are focusing on one topic versus another. And I would like to propose the idea of tweaking a particular ministry that focuses on agriculture to have it focus on food as a multi-dimension, because food is not just one thing. It's not just the production of rice and sugar. It's not, it also includes aquatic life. It includes those other elements. And many would say, well, those departments exist within the ministry, so
Definitely.
why are you just asking for a name change? I think it's time to update it, to be frank with you. I also think it's important that that ministry carry some more measures that the public can actually access data in real time. And in order to make that a reality, there needs to be some sectioning off of the ministry to become its own independent, sub-independent spaces to create a larger space for more folks like yourself to be able to ask questions. Because when you have them as a homogenous area, it's very easy to shut out people who are wanting to do work because it's all housed within one unit. I think at the same time, policy design needs to be changed in how we design, how we think about it here. In my own research, it's very clear that during cabinet meetings is when a lot of the major decisions are being made. And they're being made by a select group of individuals who think that they're very much in tune with what is happening in the everyday realities of Guyanese people. And it's not my place to say whether it's yay or nay. But it would be great for us to start thinking about what the SRDC is doing from the ground up, as Walter Rodney would properly say, from the ground up, from grounding. And I wonder what that would look like for a place like Buxton, or what that would look like for a space like, I don't know, 63 Village Quarantine, or what it looks like for a space on the highway like Kurukururu. And those village councils coming to the state with their own recommendations that the state can actually pay attention to, so that the citizens of this country embrace the idea of a constitutional right to food and take this initiative up for themselves. The next thing I will add is that there is a tendency to quickly adopt large-scale farming as a quick fix solution. I think backyard gardens and urban agriculture, and yeah, I'm very comfortable saying the term urban agriculture right here in the city, can be also a great way for people to start reconnecting with what is happening in their broken food system. Even in New York, our partnership with the Mayor's Office of Urban Agriculture does this exact same kind of work in the city in a space that's highly, highly urbanized. And yet, there is an enough of a collective of small farmers there that are now working towards having their produce being purchased by major suppliers. So it's not a one solution thing. I think we just need to change our lens in terms of how we're looking at this problem. And a ground up approach, I think, is the most useful part, in addition to the dismantling of the Ministry of Agriculture into multiple sections, renaming it to the Ministry of Food Security, but then at the same time, having those smaller factions be largely accountable to the general public. The final thing I will say, for the sake of time, is it's important that there is an external group of monitoring evaluation advisors that are attached to these fractioned organizations, so that they're able to provide the Guyanese citizenry in real time the changes that are happening, and more importantly, above all, real-time updates of data that is available. We still haven't had new updates of nutritional deficiencies among Indigenous peoples from since the mid-1990s. That kind of research needs to be done within the communities. So there's a lot to be done there, and I think it's important to start opening up these spaces for external input.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chatarpal, and I wish you all the best.
I really appreciate
with
it.
your work, your visit to South Rupununi, and the conversations that you continue to have with institutions and policymakers. And to our viewers, thank you so much for listening. I've been your host, Svetlana Marshall. Do join us next week, same time, same place, for another edition of Sources.